Welcome. We are South Jersey Quakers, and we want to introduce two friends who have been active in the climate change movement. This will be an opportunity to talk a little bit about how Quakers are trying to make a difference in addressing the most critical global issue now. Climate change is already threatening different communities, and it's important, very urgent, that some action be taken. With us today are Ruth Darlington, who is clerk of Medford Meeting in Medford, New Jersey. And she is also the co-chair of the Eco-Justice Collaborative, which is part of Philadelphia Yearly Meetings activities. We also have with us Alden Meyer, who is retired after 30 years of working with Union of Concerned Scientists, where he was engaged at both the national and international level in different discussions around climate change. So welcome to you both. Alden, would you talk a little bit about the kinds of work you were doing with Union of Concerned Scientists, and now that you are focusing solely on climate change?
Sure. Well, I came to UCS back in 1989 to start up its climate and energy program. At that time, UCS was almost entirely an arms control organization. That was the founding issue for UCS back in 1969, was out of a university teach-in movement across the country around Richard Nixon's efforts to build space weapons and ability to have a first strike capability against the Soviet Union. And they were protesting research that was going to physics departments at major universities around the country to develop that technology. That was how UCS got started. But after the summer of 1988, where we had a huge heat wave and drought, and it was when James Hansen testified to Congress saying that it's almost certain that we're seeing the effects of global warming. UCS decided they needed to get active on this issue, and so I came to join them and to start up that program. And over the 31 years I was there, I worked on a number of fronts, of course, domestic legislation, state work around things like renewable energy standards for electric utilities, requiring that they get a larger share of their electricity supply from clean renewable technologies. But I also focused on the international climate negotiations landscape, from the original Rio Earth Treaty in 1992 to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, the Paris Agreement in 2015, et cetera. So I've been active at both the sort of state, regional, national, and international levels over that time. I did leave UCS 2 months ago to be able to focus all of my time and energy on climate policy, sort of at the nexus between domestic US policy and international policy, because this is going to be a very big year or two coming up with a new administration taking office next month, the big climate summit in Glasgow, Scotland, under the United Kingdom's leadership next November, and of course the G7 and G20 international leaders processes, which the United Kingdom and Italy respectively are chairing in 2021. So there's a real opportunity, I think, to live into the commitments that more countries are making to reduce their emissions to net zero by mid-century, to get ahead of the climate crisis. That requires a lot of action domestically, of course, but it also requires international cooperation. And I think with the incoming Biden-Harris administration, there's some real opportunities to rebuild some of that multilateral trust and cooperation between the U.S. and other countries. So I'm working here in the U.S. with a number of groups in coalition around that, and I'm also working with a London-based think tank called E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism, and my focus there is going to be trying to rebuild some of the collaboration between the U.S. and Europe on climate action.
Wow, that's a lot of, we've seen a lot of history. I'm so glad you can be with us to share this. Ruth, do you want to talk a little bit about the kinds of work you've been doing both at the meeting level and on a broader scale?
Sure. When I first learned about climate change, I was honestly appalled that I hadn't known about it sooner. And, you know, the threat to society as we know it seemed so apparent. I was floundering around looking for anybody who was doing anything about it. The local Sierra Club meetings didn't talk about climate change. I joined 350.org. I didn't realize Quakers had been working on this issue for a long, long time. And I was fortunate to get connected to the Eco Justice Collaborative, a Philadelphia yearly meeting, through Margaret Mansfield and Ed Dreby. And at the same time, we were forming a climate change group at Medford meeting. And I got involved with Earth Quaker Action Team and was part of their campaign against mountaintop removal coal mining, and took the first leg of their hike from Philadelphia to Harrisburg. I just went as far as Swarthmore, but it was really an important experience for me for a lot of reasons. But one of them was that in order to prepare for that, I had to start walking to meeting every Sunday, and that raised awareness in the meeting about what I was doing. And I just bring that up because I think it's really important that you talk about what you're doing, not in a effort to convince people, but the more people see individuals taking action against climate change, the more inclined they are to pay attention if it's somebody that they know. With Eco Justice Collaborative, my project has been raising awareness about climate change. I started out showing a documentary called The Wisdom to Survive at different meetings and quarterly meetings. And then I switched to working with Pachamama Alliance locally to put on workshops, helping people to implement solutions from Project Drawdown. And we had a 5-workshop series at Medford meeting. I did introductions at Tri-Quarter Conference, and then another climate change workshop last year at Tri-Quarter, and even went as far as Reading to do an introduction. And there's been a lot of really positive response to that program as well. A representative from Philadelphia Yearly Meeting to Earth Quaker Action Team, where I serve on the Publications Committee, which is all about communicating awareness and solutions. And I'm also on the FCNL working group.
FCNL being the
Friends Committee on National Legislation, right? And we're seeking to build a really strong relationship between Quaker Earth Care Witness and Friends Committee on National Legislation, because at this point, it seems obvious that without action at the federal level, we're not going to solve this problem. Locally, we've tried to raise awareness. We put solar panels on our meeting house and had an article in the local paper about why and how. We've been doing Fridays for Future Vigils until the pandemic made that less appropriate. Then we started doing the monthly shoe strikes for climate. We've put on a climate change film festival with Pinelands Preservation Alliance, which was an all-day event that was very well attended, considering it was a first-time effort. And then we've had programs open to the public about green investing, filming the movie Sustainable, and a couple of other events as well. But the idea is that we're trying to reach out to the larger community. And that includes working with Pachamama Alliance, Green Faith Alliance, which has started a chapter in Southern New Jersey, and Interfaith Power and Light.
I want to ask you both now, how does this work fit with your understanding of Quaker values, the testimonies, which are sort of the core values that we hold dear? Alden, do you want to address that for us, please? I should mention that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes to the heart of Quaker faith and practice in terms of living lightly on the earth. The old phrase, live simply so that others may simply live. Because if you look at the climate crisis, above all, it's an equity and inequality challenge. The countries and communities that are suffering the greatest impact of climate change now are disadvantaged communities, both in our own country and around the world. And they're suffering that because of no fault of their own. They're suffering it largely because of the way that we built our economies in the developed countries, Europe, Japan, the US, others, which some developing countries are now replicating, unfortunately. on the basis of exploitation of fossil fuel resources, coal, oil, and natural gas. And those who had very little to do with causing the problem are suffering the greatest impacts of it, and we're not providing enough support to them to cope with those impacts, which is another part of the story. We really have a need to not only address our own emissions and try to reduce the impact that we have through both personal action, consumer action, local, state, federal action, international action, but also then to help deal with the impacts of climate change, which we're going to be suffering for decades, no matter how fast we move to decarbonize our economy. And that's a fundamental justice issue, which I think goes to the heart of Quaker teachings about seeing that of God in every person. And I would say that one other organization that we haven't mentioned yet is the Quaker United Nations office, which I worked with over the years in the international process. They're part of a broader interfaith UN coalition, which has brought sort of the ethical and moral basis for climate action into the international conversation, which is very helpful. And I would just echo what Ruth said. I think the work of groups like Interfaith Power and Light and the Green Faith Alliance and others that are working across denominations and faith beliefs is very powerful when you're talking to a member of Congress or a mayor or a governor or a city council person, to know that no matter where you're coming from in terms of your own faith beliefs, that you're united on the need for climate action really makes an impact on those decision makers. So I would encourage people to get involved in those interdenominational efforts as well as through your own meeting or yearly meeting.
Ruth?
Well, first I have to say, for me, religion is a pretty basic matter. It had, when I was growing up in the Episcopal Church, it was, and as a convinced friend, it continues to be about loving your neighbor. And for me, I do believe that there's that of God in all creation. And that means that every man, woman, and child, every other creature on earth is my neighbor. And that's not just some romantic idea. Millions of people, billions of species live downstream from me. My actions have an impact on them. People who have never contributed to global warming and species that have nothing to do with global warming are feeling the effects of how I have lived and my Western lifestyle choices. And granted, for 2/3 of my life, I didn't even know what climate change was, but now I do. And because I know now, I'm responsible for taking action to prevent further suffering. So I guess in a nutshell, it's loving my neighbor is acting on climate change.
Linda, one thing I would add, I think we can't look at climate change in a siloed way. It's part of a larger system of inequality, injustice, oppression that I think we as friends are concerned about. It goes to the peace testimonies because climate change is fueling instability and conflict around the world. It goes to consumption and wealth inequalities around the world. It's worsening those, and obviously both here and around the world, it ties directly into environmental justice, racial justice, those whole set of issues. So the slogan we came up with when we were organizing the 2014 March in New York and around the world in coordination with the Secretary General's climate summit that year was to change everything, we need everyone. And I think that's the growing power of the climate movement now. It's connecting into these other movements for economic and social and racial justice. And that's really the only way we're going to build the power and the ability to stand up against the very powerful interests that are wedded to making money off the current model of carbon and climate pollution.
And one other thing, Linda, we didn't mention the testimony on integrity, but to me, knowing what we know, if we don't act, if our lives and our actions don't reflect that knowledge, then we lose our integrity.
you've both touched on quite a few different ways that you have been involved in the movement to address climate change. I'd like to shift and think about that a little more systematically, touching on how you and how people can address it in your personal life, then also addressing in the community, and then finally forced to end with a conversation about national and international activities and how we as individuals can support them. Let's start with personal life. What are some things that perhaps you have done in your personal lives, or things that you've seen other people do that really can make a significant difference, even if you don't get involved in an organization?
Well, I can start on that. My organization, Union of Concerned Scientists, that I left recently, many years ago, put out a book called Cooler, Smarter, which is still available, and it's still very relevant, even though it's, I think, 8 or 10 years old now. Others have done this as well, but it looked in a scientific way at what are the things that make the most difference in terms of your footprint in your personal life, and it comes down to the fact there's 3 that dominate almost everything else. What kind of building you live in, how you heat your home, is it energy efficient? Are you heating it with electricity, solar, oil, gas, etc.? Your personal transportation footprint, which includes both what kind of car you drive, do you commute to work as a single occupancy commuter, aviation, especially international aviation, which I feel a little guilty about with all the travel I've done over the years for climate negotiations, but that's part of the footprint. So sort of transportation is the second one. And the third one, which a lot of people don't think about that much, is food, what you eat and how you eat it. And it turns out that meat consumption, particularly beef and lamb, is very carbon intensive because of all the inputs that go into growing livestock, the feed, the fertilizers, the energy used to produce that feed, etc. And if you look at those 3 areas, what you eat, what you drive, and where you live, how you live in your own home, that constitutes a majority of most people's emissions. And there's a lot of things you can do on each of those fronts, which we could talk about.
Thank you. And Ruth?
Well, thanks for the outline there, Alden. I'll try to plug into that. I have been for the last 5 years buying my electricity from a third-party provider that is 100% renewable, mostly wind. I drive an electric car, and I feel good about that because I'm plugging it into a system that uses 100% renewable energy. And I did switch to a plant-based diet about 3 years ago. No meat, some dairy, but I pretty much dropped out of that too. And I also tried to buy my food from local regenerative and organic farmers because I think the regenerative movement to rebuild the soil is really important for carbon sequestration and produces healthier food for us too. The trick now is going to be to produce that food in a way that makes it affordable for everyone. And that's the food justice and the food security issue is important. And I hope that becomes a part of whatever climate justice work we do. What else? I've heated my house the right way. Oh, I guess I covered everything. But there's one thing, there are a lot of things that people can do on the individual level. And I still think that what Bill McKibben has been saying recently is really important to remember too. And that's that the most important thing that individuals can do is be less individual, to join together, find groups in your community at the state and federal level that allow you to make an impact for systemic change, because this problem cannot be solved by each of us individually.
That makes a perfect segue into how people can get involved in the community level through their place of worship, through the places where people work, or community groups. Ruth, at Medford meeting, I know you had talked about having solar panels installed And I know you've got a nice grassy area that people can use for walking and recreation. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what the meeting is doing and how you're involved at the local and state level?
Sure. We are trying to continue to raise awareness in the community, and one of those, the solar panels was a perfect example of a win-win situation, because not only did we do something good for the meeting, but we also did something that's very visible to people in the community, and we publicized it in the local papers too about why we thought it was important. The climate change group has also become involved with the new forming Green Face Circle in southern New Jersey, and their efforts include lobbying the state government and watching the state government to make sure that they are staying true to their energy plan and working on environmental justice. And we're also working to support, along with many other meetings in the Eco Justice Collaborative, a minute at the yearly meeting level that would make climate change a corporate witness. And the reason that's important is that it would allow resources and staff to support monthly and quarterly meetings in their efforts to reduce their carbon footprint. And it would also give the yearly meeting extra moral standing and speaking truth to power and working to unite with other groups to speak to the people that really need to make changes.
Ruth, you've been talking about different ways that Quakers organize ourselves. Our place of worship is called our monthly meeting, and a regional group of meetings is called a quarterly meeting. Philadelphia yearly meeting covers South Jersey, half of Pennsylvania, Delaware, and parts of a few pieces in Maryland. Alden is with us from a Delphi meeting in Maryland. Alden, do you want to say a little bit about how your meeting or some community events that you're seeing in your area?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ruth has covered some of it. I would just say that a lot of the impacts, emissions impacts of climate change are driven at the local level. So getting involved with your school board and what's happening to renovate schools to reduce their carbon footprint, or universities, getting involved with your mayor and city council. 70% of the emissions come in one way or another from cities, and there's a lot that cities can do. Actually, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cities and mayors that are now involved in a movement called We Are Still In the US, which was launched in the wake of President Trump's decision to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement. And together with the 25 governors that are part of that movement, those cities and governors cover over half of the US population and nearly 2/3 of US economic input. And they have been doing a lot to step up and address this problem. Many of them have made commitments now to get 100% of their electricity from clean sources. A number of them are going in the direction of net zero emissions, joined by a number of companies, major companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and others. So I think this subnational effort has really been important, especially during the Trump years, but it will be when President-elect Biden, Vice President-elect Harris take office as well, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. Most electricity generation decisions are not made in Washington, they're made at the state level. Transportation decisions are made at the state and local level in terms of zoning and commuting patterns and mass transit, et cetera. So there's a lot that people can do, and meetings have been involved in their state legislatures. I know the Delphi and Baltimore yearly meetings have been involved in the state legislature in Maryland. There's been a lot of activity there around renewables and protecting the Chesapeake Bay and other issues related to this. But you can even go more granular. You can talk to your parent-teacher association. You can go to a city council meeting and push them to have a climate action plan and put it in in the city budget. There's any number of ways that people can get engaged at the local level, which can make a lot of difference.
Linda, that reminded me of a good example in Pennsylvania of how Quakers are working at the state level, trying to get Pennsylvania to join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative known as RGGI. And Pennsylvania, although it is the third emitter, I think, of greenhouse gases in the nation, is the only state in this region that hasn't joined. And Governor Wolf is trying to get Pennsylvania to join by, I will say, decree, because the legislature will not do it. And Eco Justice Collaborative members have testified before the Department of Environmental Protection in favor of this. You can imagine, as Alden said before, that there are strong, strong opponents to this within the fossil fuel industry. But these people have testified, I think 5 or 6 that I know of personally have testified before the Department of Environmental Protection in order to try to promote Pennsylvania joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which would have a huge impact not only on emissions, but the money that would be collected through this program would have an impact on the air quality and the water quality, because Pennsylvania's constitution would require that this money be spent on efforts to improve the environment for the citizens of Pennsylvania. And that could include everything from renewable energy to solar farming to regenerative agriculture.
And I would say on that, the one area we haven't mentioned is the ability to put pressure directly on companies to change their behavior, and in your case, to support Pennsylvania joining RGGI. People can be pressuring their local electric utilities or their banks or others that have influence in the governor's office or the legislature to support these actions. There are shareholder campaigns, there are direct consumer campaigns, there's a whole divestment movement that Bill McKibben and others launched over a decade ago that's become very effective. So going right to the corporate power structure and pressuring them to take action, you need to look at that as much as looking at your elected officials to make change.
Yes, locally, there's a movement, a national movement called Stop the Money Pipeline, and they recently had a rally and had a program that allows any of us at the local level to go to banks and insurance companies with a letter asking them to stop financing fossil fuel infrastructure.
So we've been sort of touching on local and national connections. Let's shift focus now to working at the national level. Ruth, would you talk about the work of Friends Committee on National Legislation and also the resources available from the Eco Justice Collaborative?
Sure. That Friends Committee on National Legislation, their lobbying training is fantastic. They have a legislative director for sustainable energy and environment, as well as a young fellow who do direct lobbying themselves, but they also train lobbyists, and they have local action groups that can, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Well, lobby at the state level on different issues. I think that one of the most important resources that they have is their Public Policy Institute that they hold at their annual meeting every year, which brings people in and gives them very intensive training for lobbying, and then sets up lobbying meetings with people's state senators and congressmen and women. And whether the issue they lobby on is climate change or not, this year it was on police reform, the experience is transferable and it's invaluable, I think. Quaker Earth Care Witness is working with FCNL to try to find a way to mobilize constituents to act on climate change, to give them the tools to contact their representatives to see if they can push them toward a number of different solutions. And from talking to Clarence Edwards, who's the legislative director at FCNL for Sustainable Energy and Environment. It doesn't look like there will be a major bill on climate change this Congress, but that climate change is going to be worked into a number of different bills, whether it's the Farm Bill or whether it is green infrastructure, whether it is COVID relief and recovery. So there are lots of opportunities to contact your congressman through FCNL. You can go right to the website, and if you put in your information, they will connect you directly to your senator and your congressman, and you can write the letter that you want to write, and they will email it to them.
So Alden, from your perspective, over the last 30 years with Union of Concerned Scientists, what are different ways that people can get involved at the national level, and particularly with a focus of international action to really take a coordinated approach to climate change?
Well, building on what Ruth said, I think what you're really trying to do is build a relationship with your local member of Congress and their staff. And there's a number of ways you can do that. Obviously, you can write letters, send emails, sign petitions. That has an impact if you aggregate enough people that the member and their staff decides this is an issue that's important to their constituents, because, of course, the number one goal of every member of Congress, or most of them, is to get reelected. So if they think this is something that a lot of people care about, they're going to pay attention to it. But you can also go beyond that. You can attend town hall meetings that they hold in the districts when they're back and Congress is out of sessions, and ask a question and press them to take action. You can try to get a meeting with them or their staff, either back in your local district or come down and do action lobby days in Washington. FCNL does that. Citizens Climate Lobby does that. Any number of environmental groups do that. UCS does that. Sometimes they do them together. And especially if you come down with a group representing a number of organizations from the district, or in your senator's case from the state, they're going to give you a meeting. And usually most of that meeting will be with their staff. You might get a drop-in of the member or the senator if you have enough aggregated power represented that they decide they've got to come in and pay at least a courtesy call on you. But what you want to do is be very clear in what your ask is, or your demand, what your focus is, why it matters to you, why it matters to their district. Understand who else they are listening to. Are there important employers in their district that they're being pressured by? What other faith leaders do they have relationships with? What about labor unions? What about other grassroots groups? And really understand their DNA and what makes them tick, and what's the best argument or approach to getting them to do what you want. But your goal is to become a trusted source of information and context for them, not just a one-off kind of meeting, but to really become someone that they rely on and think is someone they need to talk to as they're making decisions on these issues. Obviously, some people then go beyond that and get involved in committee hearings or testify at field hearings that their member of Congress does. That's a little higher level of engagement, takes a lot more preparation and work, but that can be very powerful, especially if you've got a story to tell or expertise to bring to the conversation that illuminates the impact that climate change is having on your district or your state, or the benefits of the solutions. And I remember back in 2001 or 2002, one of the most powerful things we did at UCS was we brought groups of constituents together to meet with senators. So we had scientists from the state laying out in detail what the impact of climate change was going to be on the state and things they cared about. So in Pennsylvania, we talked about apple production, which is a major industry for the state. And in Michigan, it was around songbirds and the Great Lakes. So you tailored that. We brought in business leaders who said how they were addressing it, the solutions were available, and they were actually making money by reducing their carbon footprint. We brought in labor leaders who talked about the employment benefits of moving in the right direction and decarbonizing your state's economy. And finally, we brought in faith leaders who said, God wants you to do this. And once you had all those people making an argument, they didn't really have anywhere to run. There weren't too many places they could go once you had that powerful demonstration of unity interest. So that's the highest level of lobbying, is to work in coalition with multiple constituencies and really bring that pressure to bear. And then, of course, UCS wasn't a group that did this, but others like the League of Conservation Voters, which I was the director of before coming to UCS, or Sierra Club or NRDC or others, they get involved in elections. And obviously there, if you can make the issue something that candidates have to respond to and pledge to take leadership on during an election campaign, then they have a mandate and feel like they have to act on it once they've made that commitment. So there's any number of things that people can do, depending on how much time and energy you want to put into it. And there are great resources, not only Quaker resources, but other resources of ways you can participate locally with others that share your belief.
Alan talked about being a resource for your legislators. And I want to just emphasize that you don't have to be an expert to do that. You just have to have sources of information that you can give them, and you have to be passionate about it. And sometimes that's all it takes. I went to several town hall meetings for my congressman, both in person and then later virtual, where I raised the issue of climate change, either as a national security threat or as a threat to the economy, because those are both things that my congressman cared a lot about. And I took a handout from FCNL about carbon pricing and the different issues that they thought needed to be addressed in a carbon pricing bill, and the concerns that they had about certain carbon pricing bills. And the next week I had a call from a staff person for the congressman asking if we could have a conversation about carbon pricing. So it's really, it can be daunting if you think that you need to be an expert, but congressmen need help. They have so many people talking to them about so many different issues. And if you can become an ally to them, you can really accomplish a lot.
Yeah, the other thing I didn't mention, you can also raise the visibility of the issue in your area. You can write op-eds or letters to the editor. You can go on local radio talk shows, local TV shows. I mean, they pay a lot of attention to what the media is covering in the district because they think that's what they have to respond to. You can also invite the member or their staff to come and speak to you. Provide a forum, an opportunity. If you can turn out 100 or 200 people from your meeting or in conjunction with other faith groups in your area, that's an audience they want to come and talk to, because those are constituents and voters. And if they don't come, they understand there's a cost they'll pay for that by snubbing you. So that's another way, is to not go to them, but invite them to come to you if you've got a big enough base to sort of attract them to do that.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for sharing your views and your experiences working on climate change. So thanks again to Alden Meyer from Adelphi Meeting in Maryland, and Ruth Darlington with Medford Meeting. We've talked a lot about different organizations being involved in this work, and we will provide information about those when this gets posted on South Jersey Quakers website. So thank you very much. And to our listeners, we hope that this has been helpful to you. Please let us know what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Thanks, Linda. It was great to be with you and Ruth.